Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Discovery Roundtable, a special production of the Foundry Roundtable. Hence the name, clearly. So I am your host, Drogan1701, and with me on this very first episode is Duncan Idaho
Hello, hello.
and Greendragoon.
Greetings.
We wanted to kind of take the opportunity to do a little bit different take on the podcast or videocast, whichever you would like to call it, than a lot of other people doing. Obviously, there is going to be a lot of people talking and doing shows about Star Trek Discovery now that we've gotten started. Our take on it is we want to do a show from the perspective of Star Trek Online players and Foundry authors, which we are. So we're always going to kind of keep that in the back of our mind as we discuss each episode over the coming weeks. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Foundry Roundtable, we are a podcast that has been very much focused on Foundry mission building and reviewing and everything that goes along with the UGC tool. We've been going for quite a few years now, and we decided to spin off this little show to be able to talk about Discovery, because this is the first time that we've actually had a concurrent Star Trek show running alongside our show. And we're all big Star Trek fans, of course, and we wanted to talk about it because we like to talk, obviously. That's why we do this. So I'm going to have our hosts introduce themselves, to talk a little bit about themselves very briefly. So, Greendragoon, why don't we start with you?
All right. Well, I am one of those people who was raised on Star Trek. I have vague memories of my parents watching TOS reruns with me, and those vague memories kind of bleed into then vague memories of the first season of TNG airing. And so it's safe to say I pretty much grew up on Star Trek. But I mean, it's something I've always enjoyed. I mean, I found value in just about each of the different Star Trek series. TNG was probably my favorite, but Deep Space Nine comes pretty close. Voyager's not perfect, but it's also got some redeeming qualities that people tend to like to ignore. Enterprise, also, I really enjoyed seasons 3 and 4 of that. And of course, I've pretty religiously play Star Trek Online and do some in the Foundry.
And our other co-host for this evening, Duncan Idaho.
So, very much similar situation to Greendragoon. So, raised on Trek, it was something. My mom watched the TOS, but my dad was into TNG, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. So, my first memories of Star Trek, actually my very first one, was Picard at the end of Best of Both Worlds Part 2. And then for me as a kid, I really got into the Star Trek movies. So Star Trek has basically just been sort of a centerpiece for me for basically my entire life. And as far as the series go, I mean, definitely find value in all of them. I've got favorite episodes in all of the series. Although I will say that Enterprise seasons 1 and 2 are, for me, the ones I look back to most fondly, because that was kind of my first series where I could take it on my own, rather than something I'd watch with a family. So that was the first experience I had of independently getting into a Star Trek series. And now Discovery is number 2.
All right, and I also have a pretty similar background to these guys. I was raised on Trek from an early age because my parents were kind of fans of the movies. They especially liked The Voyage Home, or The One with the Whales, as it was called in my household and probably a lot of other households. And I finally got to watch Star Trek live, or, I became old enough to do that at the tail end of TNG and partway through Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine is definitely my favorite, but I like stuff in all of them, and I'm going to take the third path from these two guys and say I actually like Enterprise from start to finish.
Yeah, I kind of it's hard for me to go back to season 3. Like, it was great watching it for the first time. It's hard to sort of get back to that without dedicating myself to a full season rewatch. One
So
and
it's
two,
more
I
of
can
a
pick up.
commitment thing.
Yeah, and I didn't quite like the full intensity storyline of just going that, making the stakes that big. I really kind of like the freeform exploration that occurred in 1 and 2. 4, I like as well. And those are kind of like, it's kind of, for me, it's like a series of Enterprise movies, which are really strong. But yeah, for me, it's 1 and 2 are just sort of the special ones. The other ones are good. It's just not quite as special for me.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you
mention serialization, exactly where I was going with that, because obviously we're here to talk about Star Trek Discovery. We had the first 2 episodes just a few days ago as we're recording this. Came out on Sunday, the 24th of September, 2017. And, well, obviously there's going to be heavy serialization. It's going to be essentially one big story with little chapters within it. This is something that we knew was going to be going on because we had obviously lots and lots of talk and discussion and information from the producers and actors leading up to the show. But it's certainly a different animal than probably anything we've had on Star Trek before. It's an even more intense version of that, what you're talking about from the 3rd season of Enterprise.
Yeah. Especially with kind of the style and the tone, too. That kind of what really kind of struck me as a big difference between Discovery and the previous series.
Yeah,
definitely in some ways. I mean, I think there's been similar
individual episodes.
Individual episodes.
But not over the course of the series, especially for pilot. And that was one thing that kind of really struck me. If we want to start getting into some of the nitty-gritty details with Discovery, or do we want to start with?
That's what we're here for.
Okay, I just wanted to say, do we want to give an overall thing first, or?
Well, maybe we should start with a little bit of a plot summary. Obviously, for this show, because we're going to produce one of these after each episode. So, fair warning, there will be lots of spoilers. It is definitely advised that you watch the episode first before watching our show. So obviously we had the first 2 episodes, which is really, really kind of one long episode in how it's structured. It just, the first one, the Vulcan Hello, flows right into the battle at the binary stars, which I kind of like that title, by the way. Mm-hmm. I like the second title much better than the first one.
Oh, yeah.
There's some inside meaning to the first title.
There is. It's true. So basically we're introduced to the crew of the USS Senjo. They're kind of out at the edge of Federation space, and they encounter a mysterious object, which turns out to be Klingons. And the Klingons are basically, and this is part of my interpretation, is they're basically maneuvering the Federation into a confrontation so that the leader, T'Kuvma, can unite the Klingon factions, because the Great Houses have been warring for a long time. And he wants to unite them, and he needs an antagonist to do that, and he's going to use the Federation.
Although there's one other aspect to his motivations, is that uniting the Great Houses is a component of basically re-elevating his own house. There's one side of him that wants to bring the Empire back together, but another one that's really kind of fighting against the pariah status he's been living with since he was a child.
Yes.
So there's a lot of really deep motivation going on with the Klingon side there.
And even down to the first scene, the cold open is the Klingons. It's not the Starfleet guys.
Yeah.
With T'Kuvma and doing a lot of speechifying as he does throughout basically the whole show, these whole 2 episodes.
Klingon monologue.
He has Klingon monologue. He has a particular style of speaking which was kind of interesting and different from most Klingons we've seen before.
Mm-hmm. And just the fact that they're so different, and I think that was something I really, really liked on this one, is that they were so different from Klingons, and it was very thorough. And it really hammered that this is a different cultural sect than what we've seen before, with some of their basic rituals, too, that strongly diverged from previous traditions. And it showed that there's a lot more diversity in the Klingon Empire than we've so far had from Star Trek, because it really hasn't given the Klingons as much time to develop.
So
they've always hinted at there's cultural diversity within the Klingons, but they haven't shown it very much.
Yeah. A lot of it's been sort of monologuing on Klingon sort of as a full species, like going back to like explaining the Klingons in TNG, the Star Trek movie, or the TOS movies. It's been a lot of sort of like dealing with the Klingons as a species and describing the traditions of the species. And there hasn't been sort of the opportunity to separate Klingons according to individual cultural traditions, I think up till like Voyager, where you had the sort of that sect of the Kuva Mag.
Yeah.
I do think they're kind of trying to separate out the Klingons more so than they used to. But at the same time, I do kind of think this is kind of Klingons Reboot 2.0. Because, of course, we got the first reboot in the motion picture when they went from TOS to the more warrior-like forehead ridges that we went with.
I would call that a visual reboot. I would say the cultural reboot happened in TNG. Because, prior to that, Klingons were not always really depicted as a warrior culture.
Yeah.
I don't know. They were originally supposed to be the sort of a stand-in for the Soviets, right?
Yeah, definitely in the original series.
And they weren't running around talking about honor, or at least not as much.
Yeah, and there was some monologuing in The Search for Spock, and it definitely was. Their outlook was very much closer to what had happened in TOS than it would eventually became in TNG. Yeah. I think it was that first episode with the renegade Klingon sort of reaching out to Worf. That I think was the first time we really got a sense of the warrior culture and some of the traditions that involved.
I don't know. I would say a lot of that still showed up in the TOS movies, because I mean you saw a lot of them in the Search for Spock, and yeah, I mean I guess 6
there was
reverts a little bit back to that Cold War.
That. Yeah, but although it's separating the warrior culture from just a militaristic culture, I think that's where there's a little bit of gray area where the Klingons were, and I think in TNG it went full on warrior.
Yeah, well, I definitely think it was good because TNG that flushed them out.
Yeah, and 6 was good because it integrated that idea of the warrior culture that TNG was establishing, with also saying that we have among the Klingons there are also peacemakers, and there are also strong women and all of that. So there has been diversity shown with the Klingons in fits and starts, and I think now we're going to see it really delved into, because at the end of these 2 episodes there is a particular crisis that is resolved, the first attack by the Klingons, but we're not going to be done with this.
No. And it's also going to take on, I think, some pretty interesting dimensions too, because T'Kuva, like the person who started all this, is killed.
Yes.
So now it's the echoing consequences of his original rally cry. Whatever the motivations for that were, there's now a war going on that the other houses are engaged with. And T'Kuva's sect is still extant, and he's probably going to have the successor in his friend the albino Klingon. Okay. And that was Volk?
Yep.
Okay.
And that's Volk, and then there's also L'Rell, who is the female Klingon that's with his people. And then there's also the one who got the most speaking time from the Klingon High Council, who is
Cole? Was it?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think just with those 3 characters, I really want to see a lot more of those guys throughout the season. You're
going to have like a triumvirate of influential people there.
Yeah, where it seems
I think Voke is going to be really interesting, because he's this, he's an albino. He is not from a prominent family or anything, but he is also the chosen of T'Kuva.
But he's got that genetic stigma too, because that was what he sort of his first character moment was. Was basically saying is that I am an albino, I'm an outcast in Klingon society, but look at my resolve. And that was, for me, Volk and Takuvma are my two favorite characters of the entire show right now. Because it's such a great dynamic. I mean, there were the villains, but they had such vulnerability to them as well. And you could really understand where they were coming from. And you can kind of see, with the conflict they created with the Federation, is that the Federation has some stuff going on too that definitely would have helped to have resolved before they went into this. But now they're just full on just in this conflict. They fell into it themselves because of weaknesses in the Federation's outlook. And the fact is that they really did not try to understand the Klingons. Because what sort of really struck me was the disconnect between where the Federation was with the Klingons in the start of Discovery versus Enterprise. Because Archer had a lot of experience with the Klingons. And you could probably say he had an understanding of how to deal with them. That completely went away.
I would actually disagree. I would say that Archer, more than any other previous captain, spent a lot of time making missteps with the Klingons. And usually because he would oppose them and then he'd tick them off. To the point that they were trying to hunt him down several times. And yeah, he was kind of there for the whole augment virus thing, but it doesn't feel like
insight. He did when on Sleeping Dogs, the end of that episode, he was able to talk a Klingon battle commander down using language he knew they understood. And that the entire episode there for Sleeping Dogs was Archer gaining insight into the Klingons. Even if he wasn't totally successful, I mean, what kind of struck me is just the fact that Starfleet did not try to do what Archer did right at the start of look into warrior culture and look into how Klingons would understand. The Federation, basically, this was emblematic of Captain Zhou's line of, we don't retreat. She just stated a blanket policy of the Federation saying we don't back down. And
well, I think she was saying in a more practical terms is that they had two outposts and colony worlds that were in that area, and she felt like, if the Senjo were to withdraw, it would leave them vulnerable.
Potentially, yes, but at the same time, there wasn't that consideration for Klingon culture and exactly what they were trying to achieve there. It was basically, there's a threat here, and it could have been anything else. I mean, it could have been, say it was an Oscan, Gorn ship, Borg, anything at that point would have precipitated the same response. So there was nothing tailored for dealing with the Klingons in how they're approaching that situation. So they ultimately gave the Klingons, or more specifically Takuvma, the power he needed to create the situation. The fleet was called in.
They definitely gave him exactly what he wanted.
And that's just the Federation wandered into that without actually illustrating Starfleet principles. They did was basically U.S. military thing without actually looking at the perspective from what we'd call the Trek ethos of actually trying to engage with the Klingons. All they basically were repeating, we want peace, we want peace. They could have said that with the Tellarites, they could have said that with the Andorians. But they were saying it to the Klingons, and it didn't mean the same thing because that wasn't where the Klingons were. They weren't thinking about things in those terms. They were scared about what the Federation represented. And the initial entreaties to the Klingons were not staged in a language that basically established what the Federation actually felt towards the Klingons. It's basically, we want peace. And the Klingons could easily interpret that as, well, you want to just sit there on the sidelines and eventually assimilate us into your culture. And they weren't talking the same language at that point. And
it feels like they've maybe, because it's established in Discovery that the Klingons have kind of been isolationist over the last century. Since Archer's time, there hasn't been a lot of contact with the Klingons. So it's maybe like Federation has forgotten all of the lessons that Archer learned.
Yeah, and that's kind of the feel.
And I think it's safe to assume that, and no one on the Shenzhou has ever actually interacted with a Klingon.
No, although they
except for Burnham, because that is, a little bit of her backstory is that she and her parents were on a colony that was attacked by Klingons. So
true,
it's not.
But I meant personally interacted with a Klingon. And
Yeah,
even
yeah.
she
It's
went.
not like she's talked with one, you know.
The parallel between Balance of Terror, where no one on the Enterprise, when dealing with the Romulans, had personal experience with the Enterprise, but they still had relevant intel, to the extent of they could sort of understand the Romulans from how they sort of how they saw the world. So there was a little bit of that feeding into how they're approaching that situation. And the Klingons are basically a blank, though, to the Discovery crew. Is basically, there's a threat here, we got to deal with the threat. We got to just stand here because otherwise we might get attacked. And doing that at that point, and this is where I really am attached to Discovery, is because they basically created a war in a very realistic way. Because this is how it sometimes goes down, where two cultures or two governing bodies aren't speaking the same language, and they run into a conflict that neither of them systemically could particularly deal with. But it eventually gets into nationalism, patriotism, anything else like that, and they fall into it. And Discovery provided that, while at the same time providing individual motivations, individual scheming and plots, and created something that felt really authentic to how this developed. And there's problems with both sides. There's problems with the Fed. And I think they're kind of in a similar situation to the Vulcans were in Enterprise, where they're not really themselves.
They're a bit more militaristic than we're used to. I mean, they're establishing that it's a slightly different era for Starfleet than even 10 years from now when TOS is going on.
Yeah, and I think the events of Enterprise are probably going to reshape, because the Klingons are in a very different space, too, from 10 years on. I think Enterprise is going to dramatically reshape the Fed and the Klingon Empire to eventually get to the point where they are concurrent with their TOS iterations.
Yeah, I mean, these are going to be formative years for these two societies. And then we'll see, hopefully we'll see that progression a little bit towards where they end up.
So I would even go so far as to say that some of the things in TOS almost kind of allude back to this, because you had a number of instances where, or specific episodes where Kirk does take that more militaristic approach to the Klingons based on previous experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, especially Scotty. I mean, he was all about, we'll send those Klingons packing.
Mm-hmm. So there's that feeling of there was a war that had just happened.
And it always seemed like there was maybe not quite open hostilities, but some kind of Cold War leading right up to the Organian Treaty.
Yeah. And it kind of feels like it didn't reach a complete resolution. It basically got to the point where they sort of mutually agreed to stop fighting rather than reaching a full peace. And it just seemed like for some reason or another, it essentially got called off almost. Or it's hard to imagine the first piece coming about in a full way.
They're just sort of organically wound down.
Yeah, it just wound. Conflict. So it's going to be interesting to see how Discovery handles the conflict, considering how complicated it seemed to be in TOS, for how it actually resolved. We didn't get the undiscovered country style, piece between them. We got something else.
It was an enforced piece by somebody else.
Well, ultimately by the Organians. But
yeah.
Before that point,
there was some sort of winding down of open hostilities.
Yeah.
Because obviously, when we start TNG, it's not, or when we start TOS, they're not in a shooting war.
But at the same time, they're still competing for resources and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're comfortable pushing it, but at the same time,
Yeah.
Although it is interesting that the Klingons in TOS actually talk with the Federation at that point. So there is going to be that progression where there is going to, I think through Discovery, there's going to be a lot more interaction between Federation and Klingons leading up to however they resolve the conflict or the immediate conflict.
Yeah. And I think, we're one of the ideas that I've had about what might be coming up, because so what we got here is a cold open for a big TV show, a big 13-hour TV show. We've seen the intro.
Yeah, and it's worth fleshing out one detail with that.
Yes.
Just to finish off our summary,
Go for it.
we got there's a big shootout between a Klingon fleet and a Federation fleet, and the Shenzhou it's not completely destroyed, but it's scuttled, and so is the main Klingon ship. So the main character, Commander Burnham, she tries to mutiny, fails. And ultimately goes with their captain to try to capture the main the main player, Takuvma, on the Klingon side. That sort of goes not to plan. Takuvma is killed, and so is
It's the very thing that Burnham warns about. Don't kill him because he'll become a martyr, which is exactly what happens.
And exactly what happens because Takuvma kills Captain Jojo.
Yeah.
So now we've got Burnham, who really screwed up.
Yeah.
And is court-martialed and sentenced to life in prison as the end, like the beginning to Discovery. The USS Discovery has not shown up yet. That's going to be the next episode.
I heard someone say it today. Like what we're seeing is the series finale of Star Trek Senjo.
Yeah.
You know, they've had a 7-year show and we're seeing the last episode.
So
and then,
it's one of those things that I think this kind of gets at one of the very different nature or aspects of the nature of Discovery is that the show is a fairly heavy amount of flashback. And
But we've already seen several.
Yeah. So I think unlike previous Star Trek shows, not only will we be tracing forward and what happens after this, but we'll be tracing backwards and kind of seeing what led up to this. So in a way, we're starting in the middle.
Yeah.
A little bit.
There's
and
so many
it's
ways you can.
not even going to be just Senjo and Burnham and her backstory. I think we're going to see flashbacks more with Takuvma as well.
Yeah, and the albino especially. I mean, I think it's Takuvma's going to come. His story is going to come through the albino story, Volk, and that's probably going to explain just what was going on with Takuvma's flagship. Because what's established here is that the Klingons gained cloaking technology somehow from an ancient Klingon vessel. Now, the question is, how did they get it? And that's a huge point for the backstory here that we don't know, but it's pivotal in the war because the Klingons now have an additional military edge. It's
so far just Takuvma who has it.
Yeah. So
where did he get it? And how did that all come about?
Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, especially with other houses waging war, possibly vying to try to get this technology themselves too. And there's probably going to be a lot of rivalries just with how everything develops here. And there's going to necessarily be information about how Klingon society has been to justify how far this goes. So I think that's going to be interesting.
I'll tell you what, that is sure going to help the Federation survive this war.
Because I think that's probably going to be how they start working towards reconciliation, is they start working with Cole or Cole or an associate of his, because he's probably not in a good position now because he bet he bet against Takuvma. He went back against Takuvma, pulled back from a war that other houses went into. So now he's on the back foot. And to regain power and status, he's probably going to take any chance he can get to try to pull the other houses back down and reassert himself. And he's probably not above using the Federation to do that, even to the point of covert cooperation. And there's been some minor scenes in the preview to suggest that, although there's other things suggested too for how the series is going to go about, particularly what exactly is Discovery.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because
they're setting up a little bit of a mystery about exactly what the ship is, what its purpose is.
I think I have a very good idea, but I'm really scared to actually say anything about it. Because
write it down on a piece of paper somewhere, and then
I've already done that on Twitter. So I've already done that on Twitter because if it is what I think it is, it's going to be a beautiful moment for some people.
You think it's something that's been alluded to previously in other shows?
I'm not going to say anything.
Oh.
No. Like, it seriously is like, I really, like, it's one point with the speculation is that you can get it right and that's kind of a spoiler. So that's what I'm trying to avoid with this one, because it seems like the show is so beautifully constructed, and certain other things have been beautifully constructed around it, that I don't want to sort of take that moment away. So I'm just that's what I'm putting my
Well, you know, in talking about how it's constructed, I mean, it's going to be one of those shows where we're not going to really have the full perspective on everything until the very end.
Although I think it's still, you can still go through it moment by moment too to see how all the parts are building, and I think you can get an idea for how this is going to be, because I think it's like what my take on it is that it's going to be more of a journey show, that you won't necessarily know where the destination is going to be, but the show is going to be about how it evolves over time.
Yeah.
Because it's definitely, they've invested so much in Burnham's character arc that seeing that in full is like, you know, it's going to be, you know, one thing, but also just seeing it moment to moment is going to be a great thing too. I think it's going to be the same thing with the Klingons, because, you know, they're now in a certain position, but we know they change. So that's going to be great. And I'm looking forward to the other characters, but I think that's my one problem with the show so far is crew interactions. And
I kind of liked so far the interactions between Burnham and Saru, although I feel like she's maybe a little bit too nasty to him.
And that was actually I did have one legitimate problem with a piece of content in Discovery, like one that just I thought may have precipitated more of an internet reaction. There's one. So at one point, Giorgio criticizes Burnham for thinking about, like, judging another species as a species. But the both of them have been judging Saru according to his stated racial characteristics for the entire show up to that point. And that sort of like, it felt, there was that one moment where it's like, don't judge a species, you know, as a species. Don't, like, because they were using Burnham as an example.
I think they're kind of using all of this to establish his character a little bit.
Yeah.
And then we'll get past that, I think, a little bit further on, because we know that he comes back and he's going to be on the Discovery with her.
Yeah. And it felt like at that moment, it wasn't really aware of how one of the characters was developing. It was a great line for Burnham and Zhuzhou, but with how they were developing Saru, it felt like it was almost a moment of hypocrisy on the part of the captain for not applying that same idea set to her science officer that she'd been serving with presumably for 7 years or more, depending. So it just felt like with Saru, I really like his character, but I don't think the show has really used him to the extent that it's possible to use him, because of everything else they had been developing, that there was other arcs, and there was this one unfortunate moment where there was an actual clash between them. It was completely unintended, and if you sort of overlook it... It was
pretty plot heavy, so there wasn't a whole lot of time for that just yet.
Yeah, but that was my one big thing. Well, actually, yeah, my one big thing that I want to talk about is just the fact that...
well, we're allowed to have other things, you know.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, that was the moment of just... It felt like it was doing Saru a disservice of actually having that line in contact with how his character had been presented, and it felt like there was two different functions going on in the writing, and at that moment, briefly, they came at heads at each other. Everything else was fine after that point, but it doesn't feel like Saru has been given sort of the chance to be more of a character in himself, and they've just been establishing his species more so. Because he's new. I mean, someone we haven't seen before.
Well, I will say that one of the advantages of Saru is that other than Berman, he seems to be set up to be the only character that gets to appear in both the flashbacks and the present.
Mm-hmm.
So, in theory, it gives him double the screen time to develop.
Become a more well-rounded character.
Because, I mean, we definitely know that Burnham went through a huge adjustment in joining the Discovery, because that was one remarkable moment with her character. There was one flashback where we saw Burnham when she first got on board the Enterprise, or, sorry, the Shenzhou. And just the way she acted and her responses were so remarkably different from the character that we'd been seeing up until that point. So we know that there was a lot of growth and development, and just with the interactions she had with Saru, he probably played a significant part of that. So yeah, we're looking forward to that. It's just like it just felt like his character so far has just been, they're just getting off the ground with him, where maybe they needed to get him a little bit more up to speed a little bit sooner, and sort of start getting into some of that character backstory, because I think that could have come into play in the first episode, especially with that first flashback of meeting Saru for the first time.
I would say that we also deal with that a little with Burnham herself, just because this episode was mostly about seeing how she screwed up pretty royally.
Yeah, with enough a gray area there to say that she screwed up, but she was right, maybe.
Yeah, I know we were debating about this. I'm not going to
say 100. I'm not going to say she's 100% right, or that even if Georgiou had gone with her solution, if that would have worked, because Takuma was manipulating stuff, but she took a gamble and she lost, and actually that's something a little bit rare in Star Trek. We see our characters take these gambles, of bucking the authority, like Picard going against the Admiral in Insurrection. Yeah. And usually our heroes win when they do that and don't suffer any consequences. Usually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or, if they suffer it's
going the other way.
Because otherwise, we've seen similar court-martial scenes before, and even if they do reach a decision, it's a slap on the wrist. It's like, demoting Kirk to a captain, which is what he wanted in the first place. Or the Tom Paris getting stripped back to, what was it? He went lieutenant to ensign?
Yeah.
Okay.
Briefly.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it hasn't had that same impact of having to sort of send a character back to square one and deal with those consequences. And that's just a great thing to see in the show, is just the fact that it is willing to deal with consequences in a way that allows that doesn't adhere to a format, because that's what it felt like previous court-martial scenes were sort of limited by, is just the format of the TV series. They couldn't really do that much to change anything. So consequences...
status quo at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
TV episode.
And I don't think we'll have a bankable status quo through Discovery, because it's a short series, 15 episodes, with a mid-season break. So it's probably going to be progressing episode to episode in serialized format in significant ways. So it doesn't necessarily have to leave things off the same way. So we get to see consequences.
I'm thinking we're going to slow down a little bit as far as pace goes, starting with the next episode, which is called "Context is for Kings." It's an interesting title.
It is.
I think we're going to slow down a little bit, because I think it's sort of like another pilot episode. We're going to need to establish the new ship. We're going to need to establish a ton of new characters. I don't think we're going to progress through things as quickly as we did in this first two-parter.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of development. I think where they're going is that there's going to be a new facet, specifically what Discovery's mission is. And that's going to, I think, give them a little bit more flexibility, because I don't think they're going to be just engaged with the Klingon War. There's something else going on. And that's been very much alluded to in that opening trailer. Mm-hmm. Where it didn't, like what they've shown us so far for the season, it wasn't war scenes.
No, not a lot.
It was other stuff. So
it was, character moments and mystery setting up, what's going on aboard the Discovery. I think we're going to be really interested to see what is going on with Captain Lorca.
I'm worried about him because I think we might be in for the standard Star Trek admiral with questionable ethics / captain with questionable ethics, like the Equinox or Pegasus.
Potentially.
And
I don't know.
Or the other side of that, which is, like the Captain Jellicoe character, who's, he's a hard ass, he does things his own way, but he gets results.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, it definitely, I don't want to put a bounds of probability. It's just that I could see myself getting a little bit more distant from Discovery if they just run through, like a Pegasus or an Equinox story with Discovery. And if Lorca just becomes sort of a ethical antagonist in sort of functionality. I think it would be a lot more interesting if they kept him around as sort of like someone who's very questionable, but someone who ultimately doesn't turn evil.
Okay, so
I don't think they're gonna.
No, and I would say that I would only be worried about this if they seemed like they were interested in making their characters one-dimensional, which doesn't seem like, because I mean,
yeah,
so I think Lorcan's going to be multifaceted,
and I hope they keep him around. That's kind of my thing. It's just I hope they keep him around because that would like a multifaceted captain like that has been sort of described as like he's going to be pushing fan buttons of keeping him around in the Star Trek universe and active. I think would be something. It's just like you will deal with people like this, and they will stay and they will stick around, and you will have to learn to deal with them. I think that would be, for me...
I think that would be a strength of the serialized format.
Yeah, that Lorca doesn't suffer a defeat. That's sort of is sort of if like at the end of the series, Lorca kind of gets what he wants, regardless of what it is. I would like to sort of see that, just because if he is this complicated character, not just sort of denying him as a villain, I think that would be, for me, very, very powerful. So we'll see how that goes. It's just my one worry it's sort of a focal point. It's sort of like how the series goes from here could in large part depend on how they handle Lorca's character. So he's got a lot of influence on how the captain of Discovery has a lot of influence on how
the rest of the show is going to go.
How the rest of the show is going to go.
Yeah.
All right. So I don't know that they're going to turn him into the villain.
Yeah. So
I don't think so. And I'll tell you what I would love to see is the Lorca and Burnham to become a little bit of a dynamic duo. You know that. They play off each other, and through that, conflict of styles, actually come up with something brilliant that will end the war in a good way. Something like that.
That's what I really would love to see as well. Just to see, Lorca challenge Burnham to see things in herself and see things about her approach that are really good for her development, and it's also positive for Lorca too. To see them as sort of like forming a mutually beneficial relationship. Yeah,
I'd like to see him help along her in this redemption arc that she's going to have to go through.
Yeah. And I don't think, at least what we've seen from the trailers and whatnot, it definitely seems like he at the very least is going to be the one to kind of challenge Burnham to kind of get out of the funk that she's in.
Yeah, and I hope it sort of ultimately comes into a beneficial way rather than him doing that through becoming a roadblock. And I can't say that's likely. It's just I would actually just put it as a fear for the series. It's not like a rational concern.
Crazy Admiral Authority figure is something that Star Trek has done a million times.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, we had an admiral that wasn't crazy in this episode.
Yeah. Yeah. And also an admiral who is not, as I initially thought, the guy from the Dead Zone. Anthony Michael Hall. He is not Anthony Michael Hall. He's actually somebody named, I think, Terry Serpico or something like that.
Yeah.
That admiral was not. He wasn't crazy. I think he maybe just.
He's kind of emblematic of the Federation at this point.
Yeah, and that approach obviously didn't work.
No, it's the stock approach of not really. Yeah, it's just the stock approach didn't really work because it really, what he ultimately did not fit the Klingons at that moment. It's just you obviously are just shouting, it's not going to work, and it doesn't work. And it was just this great moment of just representing.
The irony being of, meeting the Klingons with an authoritarian approach might have worked some other time.
Yeah, and just how that situation evolved. It's just there needed to have been sort of feedback, understanding the Klingons, and that's where that's hopefully what's going to change about the Federation is that they will adopt a more Federation outlook.
and obviously, we know that over a century or so, they will adopt that outlook because the Klingons will become allies by the time of TNG. So
yeah, so it seems like
we might see the beginnings of that better cultural understanding.
And I think that's really great for the writing is that they made sure that this moment, it's a very important one in many respects. It's not just a good character story. It's not important because it's hitting a sort of a foot, like it's hitting a title that we know happened at some point, the Klingon War. It's actually making it, through all the backstory elements, important in like just the evolutionary development of the Federation. It's important in every respect. So it doesn't feel artificial, doesn't feel forced. It's like this feels natural to have as a series, and it feels important, it feels compelling.
Yeah. So there were maybe a couple of things that didn't really work for me in these first couple episodes. First one is very sort of small and simple. It's I didn't really care for the weapons fire sound effects.
A little more pew-pewy.
A little too pew-pewy, and they lacked a certain weight that some of the other previous Star Trek weapons effects have had.
Oh yeah, like in First Contact.
First Contact, and the TNG era and all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of the visual style was made to evoke the J.J. Abrams movies, and I think that's a reasonable approach, because that is the latest Star Trek. That's what's in the minds of the general audience. I don't criticize them for taking that approach, but the weapons fire effects, both visual and especially sound, didn't work for me that much.
Yeah, and I think it's also too, it's just modern sci-fi kind of looks that way.
Yeah.
And a little washed out, a little more restrained in certain areas, and not going for super large effects with some of the weapon. It's because sort of like thinking back to some of the Expanse space battles, which were more restrained. So it's just like, I think it's more sort of a modern stylistic take, rather than necessarily factoring into the J.J. Abrams movies, but I think that probably also just helped inform modern Star Trek. That if they did something that was completely divergent, then it might have lost people
it certainly doesn't look too divergent from what you'd call modern sci-fi, which, like The Expanse or Dark Matter or Killjoys, those kinds of shows.
Yeah. And
it's very much of the moment show.
Yeah. And I think that's good, because it allows it to have sort of that immediate cultural weight, and not just try to go for something that's timeless, but also feels disconnected.
Yeah.
So it feels like
it is a 2017 show for sure.
Yeah, and it feels like it's moved on.
Is true of every Star Trek show that's been on. TOS was a show of the 60s. TNG was a show of the late 80s and early 90s. Deep Space Nine and Voyager matured a little and was shows of the mid to late 90s. Enterprise was a show of the early 2000s.
And you can definitely see that on the bridge with the LCD screens.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I do love the interiors. I think they're great. I was just rewatching the first episode a little bit while eating some dinner before we recorded this, and I was just looking at the bridge, and it's like, oh, this is really cool.
I thought the exterior shots on the Federation ships, they seemed a little washed out. So it was a little hard to tell what a certain ship was. So it was like, especially for like the Europa, I had some, like, until they sort of got to a few other shots of just like, what kind of starship is this? Okay, I can see a nacelles, I can see a hull, but I can't quite work out how they fit together. I think Shenzhou was a little bit. It was just, I think, the lighting of that particular environment that sort of
it was,
out.
and they didn't linger on ships a lot. Maybe with the exception of the Europa. It's funny. It's taking this back to Star Trek Online, which we're going to be doing. I was looking at that very first shot of the Europa, which, as soon as that tractor beam hit the Senjo, I thought for sure that was going to be Discovery, and it was going to be a big reveal, but it revealed the Europa. I was looking at the Europa, and I was like, that's a Shikar class from Stowe. The little light cruiser. It's not, obviously, but it looks a little bit like that from below.
Yeah, it's got
it actually has two more nacelles up on top.
Yeah, so it's kind of like fitting a few parts together in interesting ways, and I think it was the lighting sort of washed out the silhouette, so you could still see the detail, but it was, again, just hard to see where you had a strut, you had a nacelle. You kind of just saw the overall shape. It was sort of this orange faded color, and that was kind of it. So, I mean, just with different
there was like I think really one other ship that we really specifically saw, which was the Tiplanahoff. It got a couple of shots during the battle that was a bit more specific, and it was also labeled as such in dialogue.
Mm-hmm. I think I did see a Discovery, whatever class the Discovery is too.
I thought maybe I saw one in the background there.
Yeah, it was in the background.
And then there was also something with 4 nacelles as well that didn't really get a close up.
Yeah, so it felt like the ships were a little less distinct than the last time we sort of had this kind of shot, which was the JJ movies. Mm-hmm. Those ships felt a little bit more distinct from each other when you saw them warping to Vulcan for the first time than these guys. And I think it's just the lighting and how they designed it. They're a little bit more sort of squared off, so the features blend in a little bit easier than giant sort of cylindrical nacelles and really dramatically cut off hull section or saucer sections.
Yeah. But still, I mean, they were interesting ships, and I can't wait to fly some of them in Star Trek Online, honestly.
Oh, yeah. Discovery.
It's not a matter of if, but when.
It's not a matter of if, but when. And actually, we already got a little bit of Discovery content. They surprised us last week with releasing the Discovery uniforms, which we all happen to be wearing here.
Yeah.
If you're watching the video version of this. So, I mean, we're going to get more Discovery content. So that brings me to a question for you guys. How would you like them, other than just putting in ships and putting in uniforms, how would you like them to do something with Discovery on Star Trek Online?
With what I can talk about, Klingon stuff. I mean, it just full stop Klingon stuff. I mean, that's just...
there could be something fun with that, like, maybe discovering an old Klingon ship from this era.
Or just continuing the houses that we learn about, or will presumably learn about in Discovery.
What are these 24 houses doing, and specifically like Takuvma's house? What are they doing in the 25th century? I'll tell you one thing I would like, because Star Trek Online has done a lot of time travel plots in recent years, and I would like them to not do that again.
I had a feeling you'd say that.
Now. I think it's been done to that. I've said this on our main show a couple times, so I'm going to say it here for posterity. I would love for them to utilize something that has only been utilized a little bit in STO, which is the holodeck. So make some kind of holo program that, I don't know, maybe covers a battle from this Klingon war that maybe the Discovery wasn't involved in, so it can run parallel to the show, but doesn't have to affect the show.
Just had a fun thought. What if they, if in STO you were to come across a Federation ship and a Klingon ship engaged in battle, but near the event horizon of a black hole, so they're more essentially frozen in time. You try to get them out.
That's a possibility. I was also I thought you were going to say on that one, if Discovery doesn't address if we don't go back to the Shenzhou, what if we find it?
There you go.
And there's a plot line associated with it.
They left it drifting, or it drifted somewhere where they didn't find it at the time.
Yeah. So it just sort of got lost in the debris field, and we just go explore it, and there's a little bit of a standalone plot with that.
Maybe we go back and explore the site of the battle. Go see all the ships that were destroyed there.
Yeah, it's visually distinct too. So
we're going to keep these episodes pretty manageable as far as time length goes. So final thoughts on the first 2 episodes of Star Trek Discovery. Duncan, you first.
I liked it. I hope they branch out the characters a little bit more and sort of show other types of interactions. I'm hopeful for this, but I definitely want there to be a little bit more going on between the characters than we've seen so far. With just a little bit more fun. Let's just put it that way. A little bit more fun between characters, because otherwise I think it might get a little wearing over 15 episodes to see something that's always intense. I'd like that if they varied the tone a bit more. And again, I'm hopeful, but again, it's just because we haven't seen it yet. I can't say we'll have that yet.
Well, we do know the episode with Harry Mudd is coming.
Yeah. I mean, they could.
I think there's several episodes actually with him in it.
Yeah. I think he's going to be along with the Discovery for some length of time. So, we'll see how that goes. But I'm not sure he'll be totally 100% comedy. So,
no, I think he'll definitely. There will be some seriousness to him.
And they've said so. It's a bit different take on a character. He's at a different place in his life, like everybody is.
Yeah, so that's where I'm thinking that even if we get Harry Mudd involved, it won't necessarily be fun. in just having more different types of character interactions. So that's just where I'm coming from. It's just like I'd like to have a little bit more of that, because then I think that would really well round the show. It doesn't have to be sort of to the point of having a Lixana Troy character, but just one or two moments, just small little character interactions. I think, it just in the course of an episode, I think we go a long way.
As long as they don't do Move Along Home, then we're fine.
No, God, no.
All right. Final thoughts, Greendragoon.
So I have been thinking about this, and I've come to the conclusion that what we've seen so far reminds me of if they were to take the episode The Emissary from Deep Space Nine, which was the pilot, and stretch it out into an entire season. And what we've seen so far is the Battle Wolf 359 scene. It's very dark. It's basically there to kind of set up the character in his or her broken state. Because like Deep Space Nine, tragedy strikes. It's very dark. They lose. And it sets everything, it kind of sets all the characters in their starting position to move forward. And so, also like that, if you were to only watch the Wolf 359 scene from The Emissary, you would have no concept of what Deep Space Nine was about. Because you don't even see Deep Space Nine until the next scene. And this is kind of like that. We haven't seen Discovery. We really do not know much of anything about it. And so, in the end, it's almost, I'm afraid to draw any conclusions about what Discovery will be like. I mean, we kind of get some style. We've gotten some style things. So we kind of know what stylistically how it is. And we can kind of guess it's going to be a little bit more serious. But at the same time, I mean, the whole episode is basically meant getting Burnham to her worst spot so that she can move forward from that. So we'll see. It'll be interesting.
Well, I think I agree wholeheartedly with you. I think, we've seen, as I've alluded to, we've seen the cold open for a 13-hour movie, or a 13-hour episode. We've read the first chapter of the book, and that doesn't necessarily set the tone for the entire book, but it gives you a jumping off place. And I think it's going to be really cool to see how they weave in the flashbacks and use that to answer all of the questions that everybody has, because we didn't get the answers to a lot of questions in this very first bit, especially with regards to characters. So my hopes is that we're going to set up some really interesting character dynamics. I would like to see Sarek, which we haven't talked about, but I quite like Sarek. I quite like Sarek, but I didn't think he was, other than the one flashback where he introduces Burnham to Georgiou and brings her on the ship, which I thought was great. Other than that, I didn't think he was integrated all that well into the story. His asides were big breaks from the action, and that didn't work for me. So I'm hoping maybe he will be integrated a little bit more dynamically and a little bit more organically throughout the show. But I think, it's going to be one of those shows where the best is yet to come. Got something like Defenders, where the best episode wasn't until 3 or 4, and we're going to have that here, where we're just at the starting place and there's a lot more to come.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I think next time we'll have a lot to talk about.
We will. Next episode we will do following the next weekend's episode, which is Context is for Kings. That'll be out on Sunday. We're going to hope to have this out around about Thursday every week. And in the coming weeks, we will also try to be integrating lots more people from the Stowe community into the show to get lots of different viewpoints. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And until next time, enjoy the final frontier.
Woo.